Hi all. Welcome to our first lecture in History 2P01. It's always tricky to figure out where to start. And a conventional way to start in a course like this is with Indigenous people. And then often, not always, but often, then they kind of get forgotten. It's kind of like a necessary or obligatory gesture towards Indigenous people. I don't want to do that. I want to get us started with some real history. And by real history, I mean things that show change, things that show a kind of evolution, things that show a kind of significance. In other words, events that matter in the future, that change the outcomes for the future. That's really what the stuff of history is all about. So I don't want to just kind of show you Indigenous people and then run away. We're going to see throughout this course that Indigenous people play a very significant role in the history of early Canada. And we need to explore exactly what that means. It's a tricky subject matter in all kinds of ways, not the least of which is because we don't have an awful lot of really good sources from an Indigenous perspective to understand the story. Most of the sources we have come from a European perspective. That is to say, the sources were written by European people. The illustration you're looking at right now is a cartouche, an illustration from a map drawn by Samuel de Champlain in the early 17th century. And he is showing Indigenous people, Montagnais and Almouchois. Those are probably New England Indigenous people, Algonquian-speaking peoples. And he's trying to illustrate those for a European audience. We're going to talk a little bit more in the course, later in the course, about images from this time period and how to think about images in this time period. It's a tricky issue. But we're really kind of trapped there. We don't have a whole lot more. And we have some. We certainly have some illustrations that are Indigenous origins, but their exact meanings and their exact representations are less clear, and they're more subject to debate. So we're kind of stuck in that kind of world. We do have a lot of emerging oral accounts, and we have a lot of traditional accounts that give us a really different sense of what might be happening. We'll see a bit more of that later in the course. We'll see some accounts from Indigenous perspectives that show the story to have occurred differently than the European account would allow. And that's really, really important. It allows that Indigenous voice in there, but most importantly, from an historian's perspective, that additional source, that additional way to possibly think about the subject matter is really important as well. So what I want to cover today is a kind of really big picture overview of who was in what we now call Canada. We're really going to look at kind of northern North America because Canada doesn't really mean anything in this time period. We're going to look at some of the Indigenous people, some of the key Indigenous peoples that will show up later in the course. I want to give you a little sense of who they are, what they're about, and most importantly, something of their history. So I want to begin here with this with this blank slate. This is North America. You can see it's the northern half of North America. You can see that you can recognize Canada there. You can see Newfoundland and Nova Scotia there on the right, and you can see British Columbia. Vancouver Island gets turned into a peninsula, but you get the idea. That's Canada there. Canada doesn't exist in the time period that we're looking at. Canada is a European creation. It's based ironically, on an Indigenous name, but that's another story. But it's as a place, it doesn't mean very much at all. And Indigenous scholars encourage us to think about this place, Turtle Island, and that's from the mythological, and others would say very real understanding of how North America existed and was created in the spiritual vision of Indigenous peoples, in the same way that Christians might point back to Eden, for example. This is what Indigenous people refer to this territory as. I want us, for at least today, but hopefully for a little while longer, to think about North America as Turtle Island. When we look at European-made maps from this time period, we'll see something more like this. Now, forgive the crudeness of this map. I just colored this in. But roughly, you might see a map that showed New France, that territory. the red territory here. So basically from Nova Scotia through modern-day Quebec, through modern-day Ontario, and down the Ohio River Valley in what's now the United States, all the way down to Louisiana on the Gulf of Mexico. So a pretty huge territory. And you would also see New England, and that's not all New England, part of it's Virginia, but for our purposes, let's just call it New England. Those are British colonies. So you have French colonies and British colonies. What the British and the French wanted you to see was their control, was their domination of that territory. This is about imperial claims as much as anything else. The thing is, when we look at the actual history, we realize that those were claims of territory, not actual military, imperial, economic, diplomatic, anything control of that territory. In fact, if we look at what they actually controlled, it looks more like this. You can see two small settlements in modern-day Nova Scotia, and you can see that settlement along the St. Lawrence River Valley, a larger settlement, and what's today Quebec, and then along the coast of modern-day New England, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, down into Maryland, and all the way into Virginia. But it's really coastal, really small, really tight. So it's not nearly as all-encompassing. And that's really important for us because we need to keep in mind that that territory that we're going to be looking at for at least the first 200 years of this course, a big time period, that much of that is still Indigenous territory. It's still controlled by Indigenous peoples. So we're going to look at some of those peoples today and see what they were up to. So here in that French territory, we'll be introduced to the Mi'kmaq people, people that still exist today in Nova Scotia, Eastern New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. And they're very influential as allies, trading partners, military allies, of course, as well, of the French, but also, and we'll see this very, very clearly, that they have their own autonomous position throughout this story. We'll also look at, here in our area, the Haudenosaunee. You might know them as the Iroquois or the Six Nations people. Very significant, and one might even call an imperial force in this time period, a growing, expanding territory. And they were a confederacy of 6 different peoples, hence Six Nations. And we'll talk a bit more about them in a moment. And then we're going to move out into Western Canada, and we're going to look at the Cree. And these are people that will show up again later in the course. So I want to situate them, and I want you to see that they have their own histories. I want you to see that they have their own pasts, that they have their own evolutions, they have their own stories. And I think what's really, really fascinating here, and I think the Salisbury reading that you're doing this week gets at that, is that history is unfolding in North America before the Europeans arrive, and it continues to evolve along Indigenous lines after Europeans arrive. So do Europeans have a big impact on this? Yes, but it's a slowly evolving story. Indigenous peoples will continue to have significant autonomy for a long period to come. So we're going to look at that general picture around 1500. We're going to look at the Mi'kmaq. We're going to look at the Haudenosaunee. We're going to look at the Plains Cree. And then we're going to talk about making some history. So this is a complex story, but I do want you to see that in some ways, Indigenous peoples were very much shaped by local ecology. Now, this is no different than, people in the steppes of Eastern Europe grew wheat because it was a, open grassland kind of territory that was good for growing wheat. Ecology matters in that kind of sense. It's the same kind of situation here. We'll see different environments shaping the kind of resource possibilities that existed for people in significant fashions. And this map gives you some sense of the variety of different ecological subsistence zones across the country. And so some of this makes perfect sense to anybody. If you think of Nova Scotia, for example, and British Columbia, these are maritime places. These are places based on the sea. So the resources of the sea matter. Southern Ontario, into New England, you can see that green area at the bottom. Much greater agricultural possibilities there. Better soil, better climate, more suitable for agriculture. So those kinds of factors shaped these people and their stories. And in fact, if you look at language groups across the country, again, this is around 1500, because this is a kind of shifting story. You can see, again, groups of language groups. And these, you shouldn't think about individual languages. You should think about families of languages. So for example, Spanish, Italian, and French are Latin-based. We call them the Romance languages. They're not the same language, but they're based on a similar root. That's what you're seeing in this map. So you can see that big kind of gray-green swath across much of eastern North America. Those are Algonquian languages. They're not the same language, but they're related language. So in the same way that a Spanish and Italian person, they don't speak the same language, but they can probably work with each other and recognize some words in a way that somebody speaking, say, Russian wouldn't. There's always going to be some, but certainly in this time period, there would have been very few. Here, if you think about the people, for example, in Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq, they're an Algonquian language speaker. The people next to them are the Maliseet in western New Brunswick. They can speak to each other fairly freely. The languages are different, but the languages are very closely related. So you can think of more or less like dialects, like different dialects of Italian or different dialects of German, for example. But if a Mi'kmaq person met a Cree person, which in this time period is not especially likely, but if it happened, they probably couldn't speak at all, because while the languages are related, they're significantly farther apart than those neighboring ones. So it's, again, a dialect, but a radically different dialect of a similar language. But again, that provides part of the pattern that we'll be looking at. Let's begin by looking at the Mi'kmaq. Mi'kmaq exist in what's modern-day Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and eastern New Brunswick. This is a map from 1755, and I want you to see. I'm just going to grab the highlighter here. This map shows different groups of Indigenous people all throughout Nova Scotia and into what's today New Brunswick. And there's a couple more over here, but they're not related to the Mi'kmaq. This is interesting for us because it shows us some of the limits of understanding Indigenous history through a European lens. You'll see on that map the Cape Sable Indians down there at the bottom. You'll see the Micmac along the north shore of Nova Scotia. Then you'll see in the eastern shore of New Brunswick, the Suroquois, which is what the French called the Mi'kmaq, along the north shore of Nova Scotia. And then up in the top, you can see the Gaspesians. Those people are all Mi'kmaq people. They're not a separate group of people. They certainly existed in different areas, in different regions, but they were the same nation of Indigenous people. Europeans thought they were different. So again, viewing this through an Indigenous lens, viewing this from an Indigenous standpoint, allows us to see a different dimension of that story. British military planners during the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, we'll get to that later in the course, they didn't understand that. So when they were dealing with the military threat of these people, they didn't understand that differentiation was not real. They thought those were different people. They tried to treat with them differently, but they were failing because they were actually the same people. So nice little illustration of how sources matter to how we think about this. This is a pretty simple example, but something worth looking at. Mi'kmaq people are a maritime people, and I mean that with a small m, not a capital M. I don't mean they were in the Maritimes. I mean they're peoples of the sea. And this is a slightly fanciful illustration. It's kind of small, actually, of a Mi'kmaq canoe, but they're really impressive canoes that they built. They were ocean-going canoes. The Mi'kmaq are known to have traded and conducted war against people in New England, people in the St. Lawrence River Valley, and up into Newfoundland and along the Labrador coast. That's a long way from Nova Scotia, and they did that in canoes. They're ocean-going canoes, and you can see on the side there's a high gunwale on the side. Those were canoes designed to withstand a wave on the ocean. Now, obviously not a big wave, but a typical wave in a fairly calm ocean sea. But if you've ever been out to sea on the ocean, there's never a perfectly calm. Don't imagine a pond. Don't imagine something flat. It's still going to be a rough sea. But they could travel long distances. Now, they were much bigger than this illustration. They would hold 18, 20 men or people. But this is a nice little illustration. It shows you that gunwale quite nicely. They lived typically in estuarine areas. Estuaries are where rivers meet the sea. And if you think about that, that's a resource-rich area. It's a place where there'd be lots of animals. It's a place where there'd be lots of shellfish, lots of fish. These would be vital resource areas for its basic subsistence of peoples. So the sea is a critical part of thinking about the Mi'kmaq. You can see as well in this illustration that canoe on the left and its high gunwale as well. That's one of those seagoing canoes, ocean-going canoes. I don't need to spend too much time on all of this stuff, but there's a lovely illustration from an 18th century French collection. It says Homme Acadien, but what they mean is an indigenous person of Acadia. They don't mean an Acadian male. It would have been French, not indigenous. Moving into North America, we'll look at the Six Nations here. They exist, of course, in our territory. You can see them here in southern Ontario, but of course the real heartland is here in western New York, northern New York, parts of Massachusetts, up, in some cases, up into the St. Lawrence River Valley, as far as Montreal. The Haudenosaunee were a confederacy of six separate peoples who bounded together, formed a confederacy, a military confederacy in many ways, but more importantly, a diplomatic confederacy, who were very influential and perhaps dominant in all of central North America. And in many ways, we might cast them as an additional indigenous imperial force in central North America. The French are imperial forces, the British are imperial forces, but we could probably call the Haudenosaunee an imperial force as well. Certainly their control of trade in central North America is very important, but they'll certainly exercise a kind of military hegemony as well. The Haudenosaunee have a history. If you just think about the name, the Six Nations, well, that didn't begin overnight. It didn't begin as Six Nations. It was initially the Four Nations, at least as far as we know. Then it became Five Nations. Then it became Six Nations. And this map is a nice little illustration of the kind of movement of the people. As you can see, the arrows here pointing to the directions of change. People moving up through into the St. Lawrence River Valley, moving up into what's the Huron territory, moving down into what's now southern Ontario, moving west into the Ohio River Valley. They were expanding, they were consolidating, they were conquering people, they were assimilating peoples, they were drawing people into their nationality, into their nationhood. And so in the period from about 1400 on, so before this course begins, into the 18th century, Iroquois Haudenosaunee history is expanding, growing, changing, being influenced by the emergence of Europeans on the eastern shores, but they had their own history, their own development, their own trajectories. They were primarily an agricultural people, and that's really significant. The Mi'kmaq rely on the resources that are at hand. There is some agriculture among the Mi'kmaq people, but not a great deal. Their primary sources of food come from hunting and fishing. So they don't have a capacity to just develop food, and most of that food comes from men, not from women. Agriculture in the Haudenosaunee provides most of the calorific content for these people, and that's provided by women. And what that means is that the Haudenosaunee can have a firm division of labor between people who hunt and people who go to war and people who grow food. So the women can grow the food and the men can hunt, but they can also go to war. That allows them significant capacity for military capacity that wouldn't exist for other non-agricultural peoples. And that's part of what makes the Haudenosaunee successful as an imperial force. You've probably seen illustrations like this before, but they lived in substantial villages, longhouse villages. Some of these houses would hold 200-300 people. These are quite substantial villages. These are palisaded for defensive purposes. And they would have strong, effective military trading communities based here. I also want to show you a quick little side though. Here's the Haudenosaunee here in that territory. And as I said, they're moving this way and this way and this way. They're expanding. But they're also meeting the British here and the French here. And another story is going to evolve here. And we're going to talk about this several weeks from now. But this will be the Wabanaki Confederacy. name is down here in the lower right. They're not as powerful as the Haudenosaunee, but very much in response to the French and British presences around them. The indigenous people of what's today northern New England, southern Quebec, and the Maritime provinces bound together in a group that comes to be known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. And it's these people. It's the Abenaki here in the southern shores of St. Lawrence River Valley in Quebec, some of the New England people, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet in New Brunswick, and here it says Ilnuk. That's what that's the traditional name for the Mi'kmaq. So those people too are forming a confederacy, and that's history. I can't stress that enough. That's indigenous people setting out on their own to make their own history. Now this one is in response to European presences, the imperial contest that emerged between the French and the British, but it's still them making their story. It's their responses, it's their actions, it's their agency in this story. Moving on to the western provinces, out of the plains, we can look at the Cree. The Cree too are an emerging, evolving people. They are dependent largely for food on the buffalo. The buffalo roam in the millions on the prairies between northern Mexico, all through the plains of the United States, up into Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, so in some ways up into the Northwest Territories. The buffalo are the dominant species of that whole ecological zone. And the Cree eat the buffalo. They use the robes for clothing. Nice little illustration of that here. Beautiful. This is Blackfoot, not Cree, but it's a beautiful buffalo skin shirt. Incredible weaving and beadwork on this. They also use it for making their teepees. It also forms part of their spirituality. So the buffalo is central in many ways to their existence. We call these people the Plains Cree, but they were actually a people who had originated in northern Ontario, western Quebec, and had moved west over the past 200 or 300 years. When British explorers moving out onto the prairies in the late 18th, early 19th century, this is more or less what they find, at least what they report and what they map in their reports on what they're finding in the West. And here's the Plains Cree. But earlier, that territory for the Plains Cree would have been something more like that. It looks like they shrunk. My point is that it moved from here to here. They're moving west. They're moving into that buffalo hunting territory. They're successful military people who are using their expansion to better access resources, and those resources are the buffalo. So what do I want you to see? Well, we can't learn all the history of the Mi'kmaq people or all the history of the Haudenosaunee people in a course like this. We're going to see them in different parts of the course. They're going to show up in different places. But to understand those roles, to understand those people's actions in those situations, we need to recognize some basic things about them. They're not all the same. Indigenous people just can't all be lumped together. They are different peoples. They have different languages. They exist in different places. They interact with each other in different ways. They have their own languages. They have their own cultures. They have their own distinct identities as a people. They understand themselves to be groups of national peoples in the same way that the Portuguese saw themselves as different from the Spanish. The Mi'kmaq saw themselves as different from the Maliseet, as different from the Haudenosaunee, and so on. And because of that, it means that there's different histories. Because of that, it means that their interactions with one another are a base from which they will go forward. Europeans will intersect those histories, and in some ways, in the long term, will come to dominate those histories, but not in the first 200 or 300 years of this course. For the first 200 or 300 years of this course, Indigenous peoples are setting their own agendas. They're setting their own courses. They're writing their own histories. I mean that figuratively because they're not writing them, but they're creating their own histories. And that's what's really, really important. When Europeans arrive, there are things unfolding on the ground. There are trade routes. There are relationships between different peoples. Some of those are good, some of those are bad. There are wars going on. Europeans will intersect those stories. And in many ways, they'll change them. But in many ways, they won't change them at all because the story that's unfolding on the ground is just the most important story. The Europeans are just some sort of distraction over on the side. in many ways a good one. They'll bring new weapons to the story. They'll bring new trade goods to the story. But they won't dominate the story for quite some time. So think about these people as distinct peoples. Think about these people as distinct cultures with their own history. And what's really, really important to think about there is that that means when they think about their actions, when they think about what they ought to be doing, when they think of their interests, what matters to them, they'll think of themselves. They'll think of their own histories, their own cultures, their own peoples as guides to those actions. In the same way that the British and the French will do, in the same way that the Portuguese and the Spanish will do. They will use those community identities, those community histories, to define the actions that will allow them to go forward. And that's really critical for us in thinking about Canada. It means that we have to stop thinking about Canada for a little bit and think about Turtle Island. We'll leave that there today. Take care.